Welcome to the FML podcast, the podcast on a mission to uncover actionable insights, explore the latest trends, and to catalyze your fintech's growth. Join Growth Gorilla's founder and managing director, Shameer Sachdev, and some of fintech's hardest-hitting marketers and leaders.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of the FML podcast. Today we're joined by Geoff Whitehouse, content lead at Clearbank. Geoff, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries, mate. Glad to be here.
For everyone listening, can you kind of give us a quick overview about yourself and your journey so far?
I feel like my journey is probably quite similar to a lot of other people who either work in content or like B2B marketing and other stuff, in that you sort of ended up in it. And now you're in it, you're never going to get out of it, sort of thing, because it was definitely not what 18-year-old me thought was going to be what, future me was going to be doing. Of like, yeah, cool, B2B content in fintech, that's definitely the plan for you, sort of thing. When I was a kid, right, I really hated like reading books and a lot of stuff to do with school. But my mom was a teacher, so she would crack the whip and like, do it. You'll thank me later for getting your GCSEs. And yeah, thanks, Mum. Turns out you were correct on that one. But I never really liked studying or learning a lot of stuff. But honestly, then my love of words, and I guess where that sort of light bulb moment for me around like content, oh, is this a thing you can even do to make a living, was really English lit A levels. And we got to do like your Shakespeare's and your Hardys, your classic sort of English stuff. But I had two amazing teachers, and we did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, and like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And I was reading this stuff, and it's like, oh, this is not like the stuff I've read before, and it's A levels. You're not asked to try and write an exam question. How does it make you feel? I was like, make me feel? What the hell does that mean? Why am I interested in this? What is it that's appealed to me? Why have I wanted to turn the page? Fast forward many, many years later, and I've ended up in London working at the financial services regulator, literally as like a temp job. Just going, oh, this is kind of a weird industry. And then that kind of morphed into then financial services journalism. And I'm going to age myself terribly here because it was for a magazine called Banking Technology. So this was before fintech was even a word. It was very much like right place, right time for me. I got an amazing education in just how financial services works. Like, I had some amazing editors, amazing bosses. And then from there, typical, well, journalism's fun, but it doesn't pay very well. Moved to an agency where it was all about content marketing. I'm sure a bunch of people probably know Metia, and like they own Finextra, but many years ago when I was there, it was very much like, we have our PR clients, but our sort of USP here is very much, do you want to do a white paper? Do you need something ghostwritten for media? We've got an editorial team that will do that for you. And I had an amazing boss there, Elton, who just like really brought me out of my shell and supported me. You're a good writer, you can do this. And then from there, a whole bunch of stuff we'll get into in terms of where I flitted about, in terms of like tech firms, consulting firms of various different shapes and sizes. I honestly feel very fortunate because I don't think it's sort of a career path you could necessarily plan. I did a geography degree, which is probably the most useless thing in the world, unless it's a pub quiz about like, can you name the capital city of this country? In which case I come into my own, but generally it's been pretty useless. And I've ended up in this industry. And again, right place, right time, being in London just as fintech was exploding. And like, this was the city to be, and working with a bunch of amazing people. So definitely feel lucky. Some of it was maybe planned slightly. A lot of it was very, very unplanned, though, to be perfectly honest.
You've ended up at Clearbank. Again, for any of our audience who doesn't know who Clearbank are, can you kind of just give us a quick overview of who they are, what they do, and then maybe just a little bit about your role as content lead over there as well?
Clearbank's a really interesting firm in that it was the first new clearing bank to be launched in the UK in 250 years. So that gives you an idea of like how the incumbents are really talking about in this space. Started in 2017, there's literally 6 people in a basement in East London. Today, we're about 600 people across the UK. We've got about 200 customers or 220 customers. I think we're probably also one of those very rare animals in that we're also a profitable fintech, profitable month on month. Our income has tripled over the last year. So we've seen like an explosion in what we're doing. And without getting into like the technicalities of what is a bank that's also a direct clearing member actually mean, essentially you work with us to get access to all the UK payment rails. That's like faster payments, chaps, backs. we maintain those connections. You connect with an API to us, and therefore you get access to those schemes without having to necessarily sort of apply to become a direct participant yourself or have to like maintain those schemes and all that technology. We do it all. That's at a very, very simplistic level. There's obviously a lot more complexity to it than that. And yeah, my role as content leader, and it's actually pretty new. The CMO here, Amy, has really been sort of pushing to make content, a lot more digital stuff happen at Clearbank. The bank has grown massively, like quite organically, but obviously now we have a lot of plans, and content's really going to be a central part of that. So she pushed for this role. Luckily, that turned out to be me. Now, really, what I've been doing from now on is just starting to implement that content strategy, working on sort of the initial phase, thinking about what comes next. That's where we are today.
I almost want to just sort of take a look back at your career and really ask the question, how has that informed, or how does that set you up for success at Clearbank? You've got agency experience, a publicist there, you're at 11FS, that I think everyone in the fintech industry
Sure,
knows. Yeah. How has your sort of experience there contributed to, I suppose, your day-to-day at Clearbank?
They're all very different animals, even though they all essentially work in the same industry of financial services or fintech. Consulting is a really interesting area. You have products and services you're trying to sell, but really what consulting outside of that is ideas and showing you understand how the industry works, because people need to use your expertise to achieve something else. And actually working in a consulting firm and doing content or comms or even messaging development really forces you to think slightly differently, because it's not like, hey, I've got this thing, you want this thing, we're going to sell it. A lot of the time it's like, this is what's going on in the industry. You're almost in some respects trying to slightly front run what you think is going to happen in the next couple of years to try and help people. Publicis was fascinating. So I originally joined a company called Sapient that Publicis bought, and Sapient was a very tech-heavy consulting firm. And then we were bought by, an ad agency, and you think, well, that's a very weird fit, right? Like, what are they even trying to achieve? And the whole thing is this phase of digital transformation a few years, but what that really meant as things went from being, transferring from analog to digitized to actually just starting out as being digital. And that was really interesting because, you're talking about a firm that's trying to kind of change where it plays in the industry. One of the big things we did there was we worked on this really interesting concept called open futures, which was basically just as open banking was kicking off in the UK. We were like, okay, we need some sort of like thought leadership vehicle that's going to kind of help present our brand in a slightly different light. Yeah, you can come to us, we can do tech heavy lifting, and yeah, we can do coding, and yeah, we can offshore stuff to help reduce ops costs. But actually, what about the overall strategy for your bank, or how you're going to target customers, or how you're going to develop new digital propositions? And so we worked on this idea called Open Futures, and the whole thing was, it was not about us. It was about talking about the possibilities that this thing was going to happen. And this was just as the regulation was coming in. And it's really exciting, right? Because it's a blank canvas. No one actually knew. We had concepts of what we think would happen. And so we were really diving into those concepts. The really interesting thing was we were positioning ourselves as a digital transformation agency, but kind of counterintuitively, the output was actually a print magazine. Yeah, you're absolutely right to laugh, because when we presented it, that was kind of the response I remember the team initially got of a print magazine. I was like, sure, but we're trying to show ourselves to be different. In this magazine, we interviewed like Megan, who at the time was sort of at Starling, a bunch of people from regulators, investors. And it was just about like what's going on. That to me was just like this really interesting vehicle. I was like, it's interesting how you can try and make people with preconceived notions try and flip those notions a little bit. After that, I joined 11FS, and I think everyone in the fintech industry knows them, right, through the Fintech Insider podcast, and really what that's done. The real eye-opener there was having particularly CEO David, who was just so engaged with the notion of what content could do for brand. He was the driving force behind that, getting to work on different podcast properties, video. But as well, we still had a blog, and we would still like produce like really interesting content. We had like this great sort of like war room mentality of like, if breaking news was happening in the industry and it's happening on a Tuesday, we're recording the podcast on the Thursday and it's coming out the following Monday, like that's quite a lot of time. So what we could do is we could initially react with a blog post that we would then get, David and Simon and other people to spread. Then we'd make sure we invited the right guests onto the podcast recording on the Thursday, and then we would follow up, maybe like a week later and we had the news show. So we had this really interesting spread of like, we were there when the news was breaking. We would get blogs out, within 24 hours of something happening. I remember when Visa, for example, announced it was going to buy Plaid, the open banking platform in the US. And we were all just like, okay, this feels like a moment, doesn't it? So it was kind of like, okay, let's talk to our head of the US, let's get his thoughts, let's send comments to the media, let's then sit down with him for half an hour, write a blog post, let's get him to approve it by end of day. Following morning, it's in the CMS and up. Is that level of agility and just thinking of like, this isn't about us as 11FS, this is about the industry and the community we're serving, providing great content and informative content. And then, like say, TrueLayer and Clearbank of different beasts again, they're very product led. And so that's a whole different challenge of like, how are you trying to separate yourself out from the noise, particularly in something like open banking or payments, where so many people are talking about, like, how do you look and sound and feel different? How do you inform people? But how do you also try and sell your company narrative a little bit? Because, you're a burgeoning company in a nascent industry. There's a land grab going on, and you can't really afford to sit back and hope people come to you. You really have to go find them and engage with them and try and scale that. So yeah, I've learned an awful lot through like different threads, but it's definitely been interesting seeing different approaches. People who content is the first thing they think about, or of us who content, like they're really not quite sure what it does, or they're very much focused on, oh, okay, so we're doing a white paper and we're going to put PDF on the website type of thing. So it's that whole range of things that, it's been an interesting experience, because you can take little bits of, okay, I've seen that work, or that definitely hasn't worked, and try and sort of merge that into sort of like an overall sort of approach to content.
And when we talk about content, the first thing that probably crops into most people's mind is probably blog posts and white papers. But it sounds like when you're talking about content, you're not just limiting it to that. You're thinking podcasts and other mediums as well. Tell me a little bit more about, what does the content ecosystem look like at a brand like Clearbank?
This is not specific to Clearbank. I think you could say this for any B2B company. I think, as we just discussed, we're just talking about different formats, right? About what you can do. The worst thing you can do is think about the delivery mechanism rather than the thing you're actually wanting to talk about. That old school idea of, hey, our thought leadership is a white paper, we put it on a PDF and maybe gate it, we'll get some leads, or, oh, hey, all the kids doing podcasts, let's all do podcasts. It's like, don't do that. It's very much like, what are you looking to achieve? Where are your audiences? What are you trying to say? And then how are you going to try and say that to them? I think once you go through that process, it may well be that actually the answer is a piece of research that's gated because you're trying to drive demand, but it could be a video series. But I don't think you should ever go into it by charging into a meeting, like slamming down your laptop and go, we need to do more video. And everyone goes, why? And it's like, okay, yeah, what does it mean? How are we going to create engaging content? Because different audiences, particularly across fintech, right? Like from B2C to B2B, people engage in content in different ways. They're on different channels or in different mediums. So to go in with a fixed idea of, we should do X, we should do Y, I think is the wrong way to do it, because you're thinking about your outputs and how you can measure outputs, and you're not thinking about what's the outcome here. Am I doing something because I want to get my brand known? Because we're a brand new brand, or let's say we're a new market entrant, either in a nascent market or an emerging market, even a pretty full market. Or are we looking to drive demand? Are we looking to drive demand with a specific audience? Are we looking to, is it ahead of innovation, which one target? Is it ahead of payments? Is it just the C-suite? What that looks like is very, very different. So in my head, I always start with, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And you will get very different answers depending on who you talk to in the organization. And that's where you really need to start thinking about, okay, from a content point of view, it's two sides of a coin, right? We're trying to do stuff around our brand, but we are also trying to deliver business growth. And what does that look like? And what's the balance between those? And how are we going to deliver this? And then you can start thinking about, well, actually, we should do this with a video because it will be more engaging and we feel like there'll be more opportunities to do this. Or, this is very much, we're going to spend a lot of money on a piece of original research, actually that we are going to gate it because we think there's more value and people will be drawn to that and more likely to give up their details to access something that's new and unique rather than just, hey, here's our blog about trending payments, which can be immensely powerful. But you have to think about what you're actually trying to achieve. And it's finding that mix, understanding the audience and the messages, and then where you go from there.
Taking, again, a B2B brand as an example, the content piece is fundamentally part of a demand generation campaign overall. Taking an example like a bank like Clearbank, when you've got your target customers few and far between and quite fragmented over the different sorts of platforms where they're consuming content, how do you approach that? Because if you've got some on LinkedIn, but some on Twitter and some that aren't on social media, some that are a bit older and a little bit more in the traditional financial services category, and some that are up and coming fintechs, how do you manage that disparity between kind of all of your target customers that fundamentally have the same problem?
Understanding where your audience is to begin with, right? And you're right, they are not primarily always going to be on one channel or the other. Like you can't take just a singular approach with this. And I think that's where you start thinking through that content mix really of, okay, there's like the free-to-air blog stuff, and then you should have video stuff as well, and then you should have the more white papers. But honestly, I think you're right. There's other things like, this is where I hate to say it, but things like trade shows do come into their own as well. And so because Money 2020 is still very fresh in my mind, and for us it was an amazing show, but it's also, it can be a bit of a treadmill, but you do meet people there that maybe they don't follow you on LinkedIn, or they're not even on Twitter, or they don't really engage in sort of other community spaces necessarily, but they do go to these big events. And so it goes back to the idea of that mix of like, okay, if we think this, and therefore we have to start mapping out, okay, where do we believe these people are? I know we'll create blog content. Okay, sure. But that sits on your website. How do you get people to come see it? It's like, okay, you now need to think through far more like the distribution side of where you're trying to get your content seen. And there's many different ways you can do this. In the payments world, for example, there's a bunch of really great sort of payments associations and communities that if your company is a part of, they offer sort of the ability to spread the content in their newsletters and that sort of stuff. So you're kind of trying to hit all these different points of where someone might potentially see you. And the more you can do that, the more likely it is, to your point, I think, to at some point someone's likely to come across it. Right? So they've maybe seen your stats trade show, or maybe they saw that press release, or they've seen your blog on LinkedIn, or they saw your video on YouTube, or the Payments Association wrote a piece about a new client you've got. So you have to really, it's trying to hit all of those things, try and understand and really measure, where are we seeing the impact, where are people coming from, where the places we should double down, and where are the things where we've maybe tried, haven't got as much traction, and how do we think about maybe trying to find those other people as well. If I take B2B payments as an example, there's some very obvious communities and spaces where those people are. So I think it's maybe a little easier than necessarily like trying to be like a B2C fintech, where you're launching something like, okay, well, who's my potential customer? Like, well, it's anyone 18 and above in the UK. How do I even begin to target that? That's a very different animal from B2B, where I think there are sort of more showcases like a Money 2020, where from a brand perspective, being there, having a CEO or someone else on stage, you start to get that snowball effect of people over a couple of years start to understand where your brand is. You build your blog, you build sort of your thought leadership, you do the PR work as well, and it all starts to come together. I mean, I would say, I think to the point you were making about like where some of these people maybe do or don't go, some of the best success I've like seen, and this is not really necessarily like content specific, is actually things people don't necessarily see or that aren't necessarily public. And by that, I mean, there's a couple of firms that do like amazing developer conferences, right? Because their focus is on the people building the apps or the services. They don't necessarily care. There's nothing they can showcase by having a flashy stand at Money 2020, but their belief is by engaging the builders behind these brands, that's their way in. I've seen this flipping. This definitely happened at Money 2020 is a good example, is people doing C-suite dinners where you just invite 10 to 12 people to have a very frank and open discussion and that sort of thing. And then I'm also seeing like a lot more companies, it feels like, start to do their own customer and prospecting events. Plaid did a really big one in the US a couple of weeks ago. That was fascinating. I mean, it kind of looked like they were trying to go for like an Apple keynote vibe, which is interesting. I saw the BVNK, the crypto platform, the other week. They did like their own little thing in London as well. So I'm starting to see a lot more people actually maybe this let's go mass, less and less, and actually let's go quite concentrated and very specific and try and find where those places are. Because actually, if we can target just 3 people at the right thing at the right event, that's better than us spending 3 days meeting hundreds of people where the business may actually never even come to us.
I think also that's even more the case when I think you're a challenger brand against quite large entities and you've got limited resource. Trying to talk to 300 people, I think it's always a nice thing to go, oh, yeah, we could really do with loads and loads of leads. But actually what you want is a handful of really good quality conversations and doing those sort of smaller events that you own the narrative and I suppose the contact details as well. And therefore the relationship, I think, can be highly effective. We do that a lot as well, really.
You have more engaged conversations though, right? Like you're not just going like, hey, what do you do when someone comes up to your stand and you kind of explain your service and like, oh, well, I don't need one of them. Like you're trying to get beyond that already of just going, okay, where are these people that are actually going to care about whatever it is we do? And how can we just have a better quality conversation? Far more effective to have those 10 to 15 high quality conversations rather than trying to have hundreds or potentially thousands. Conversations you could have at that scale from like a brand point of view. When it comes to sort of that real sort of business conversation of like trying to talk to customers and identify prospects, I do feel like it feels like more of the interactions are going more towards these a developer type conference or a more focused event where you actually sort of say, actually, there's something we can do here that is maybe a little bit more behind the scenes. Like it's not going to be flashy, but you almost want it to have that exclusivity of like, actually, if you've been invited to this thing, it's actually going to be more interesting because there's not really going to be a hard sell. You don't need to walk through, an exhibition hall full of 35 vendors whose stands almost all look exactly the same. It's actually going to be a better use of your time as well to be at those events.
A lot of these events end up kind of getting a little bit crazy because everyone then starts getting a bigger and bigger stand and more. And anyone who's ever worked within like the gambling or gaming sector, who's ever been to ICE,
that's quite an experience.
You only ever need to go once, and half a day will do. When they had the Ferrari with an entire casino inside the venue, whichever brand that was, had clearly kind of won that one. I really want to put that emphasis on smaller, more laser-focused events, especially for the brands who I think can even be larger brands as well. In fact, if anything, I think larger brands could be doing more of that as well. There's quite a few vendors that I can think of that I think they're in a prominent position where they've got brand recognition and they can very easily pick up the phone to their target customers and the call will be picked up. But it feels like sometimes they lack something, kind of like worthwhile to say, and actually having those sort of round tables could be a great way to sort of create conversation and understand what challenges their target customers are facing, and then be the people there to help them try and solve it.
And also you can create content off the back of it as well. Like I'm saying, they're sort of behind closed doors, and in some respects those conversations are. But you can obviously, get sound bites from people as like a promotional thing, or like you could look to record podcasts or do video interviews. I'm definitely not saying you should not do those sort of things. I personally have just seen this trend of what I think is becoming more effective. Like you say, these slightly more targeted things. We're actually going, look, we're not just going to talk about payments today. We're actually going to talk about this very specific thing or this very specific issue, or we're going to talk to a very specific segment. That could be just small business owners in the UK as an example. And that you're going to have a better quality of conversation. You're going to have a more engaged audience. And I think, the content, whether that stays behind closed doors or does get surfaced in different ways, is going to have more impact over the medium to long term. It might not necessarily lead to a sale straight away, but you're certainly going to be building brand equity with the right sort of people.
Ultimately, what you're sort of saying, and I think what we're agreeing on, creating high quality conversations and therefore high quality content, and kind of like sort of zooming back out again, out of these sort of smaller events into sort of the wider content landscape. I mean, financial services is notoriously dry for the types of topics and content that it produces. And I feel like it's always this fight between sort of like marketing and I think not just compliance, but probably the C-suite, between trying to make something really exciting and then kind of being pulled back on it. I've kind of got two questions on the back of that. One is, what does good content look like in fintech and financial services? And then second of all, how do you manage those relationships between compliance and stakeholders in order to create good, high quality, engaging content?
So I think like taking that part about, what does good look like and how do you have those conversations with different stakeholders, right? For me, it goes back to those fundamentals we discussed earlier of like, and maybe we'll get into this later about, how do you design a content strategy when you're at a company or whatever, like don't go in and go, here's my content strategy. And everyone goes, what? Well, this is just a PowerPoint of like things you want to do. It's like, what's the company looking to achieve? And by achieve, that can mean very different things at different stages of growth. Like, if you're like a Series A, Series B, you're really trying to grow your brand, right? That you're trying to get known for things. And realistically, you can probably be a little bit, let's say, more boisterous in sort of tone and things. I think, I don't know if you remember, when now Wise, but TransferWise, like this first in its infancy, there were people wandering around with like a coffin around the city of London going like death to, FX fees and stuff. Wise today probably wouldn't do that because it's a very different company, right? But it still has the same thread and same narrative, and it's still very true to what Wise is as a business, right? But it's at a different stage of its life. And so I think it's, first of all, what are we trying to achieve? And that looks very, very different depending on the stage of firm you're at, right? Who are we actually creating the content for? I feel like a lot of B2B fintech content particularly falls into this trap of we're doing it because we think we should do it, and no one's really thought about if anyone's reading it or why it really matters. The point we talked a little bit about distribution, about like how are they even going to find this content, right? So, and there's so much stuff out there. If I just think of like, maybe the sector Clearbank works in, like obviously a bank, and we're talking in payments, and we have direct competitors, right? But if you think about in the very broadest sense, if we're talking about payments trends, well, we're not actually just trying to, the noise there is not just like us and the banks, it's every open banking platform, it's every card company, it's every PSP, it's payment orchestration layers. You've suddenly got hundreds of firms all trying to cover a slightly similar topic. Maybe they have a different entrance point, but fundamentally a lot of it is the same, and they're trying to appeal to broadly the same crowd of people. And and I think there's been this huge push over the last, I'd say, like particularly 2 to 3 years, like let's create informational content and let's primarily put it on our blog. And you go, okay, like you could, I think we were joking earlier before we started recording, a different thing entirely, but I feel like you could look at blogs of a lot of B2B companies. If you change the colors and the logos, you go, it's the same company, right? Like there's just so much of that out there. And I completely understand how and why that has been created. And hey, look, I will hold my hands up and say I have been responsible for creating some of that previously. But who's it for? Why are we doing this? What do we think it's actually going to achieve? And I think, that comes back to that point we touched on earlier about, being hyper targeted about what you're talking about. And so if I think about it very specifically now from like a Clearbank point of view, we have a very interesting story to tell. We're a new challenger of what has been a very incumbent and heavy industry. We have a lot of expertise, we're deeply embedded in this industry. So a lot of my thinking is like, okay, but how do we talk about that without descending into that quite blunt and quite generic content? We have, I think, the brand equity to talk about, market infrastructure changes, big things happening. If I think about what's been going on the last couple of weeks, central bank digital currencies, stable coins, we are going to be quite heavily involved in that in some way, shape, or form because of where we sit in the industry, right? But we probably shouldn't be talking about, what are the pain points of open banking or how will open banking take off? Whereas, if I think of something like a Tink or a TrueLayer or Plaid, their brand equity is very much more talking about that, and not that other stuff necessarily. So I think it's finding that, what does the audience care about? I think, yeah, the format stuff I think we've discussed of like how do you do that? How do you find that tone? When you're trying to be informational or you're trying to present facts, that's where it gets quite trying, right? You know, if well, this has happened, and therefore X, Y, Z is going to be the outcome. So I think it's actually trying to mix up that with trying to ensure your company is comfortable with having an opinion and a stance on things. And that's not an easy thing to do, and it's definitely a journey for people. And it's not something that happens, you know, you start doing it and a quarter later, like your content's fundamentally changed. It's like we're talking like 6, 9, 12-month journey. It's like these are the steps we're gonna start taking to do this. Like if something happens in the industry to do with payments, we definitely have the brand equity and the knowledge to talk about it. We should be doing it. So I think there's that one side. I think, you know, I will give credit where it's due here because this is not my phrase, but DeBose over at Rival, I'm sure you guys know, you know, I think he had the best sort of summation of like how you think about it. It's like you don't tell people you're funny, you tell them a joke. And I think that's a really great concept of thinking about what you're trying to do with your content and who it's for, right? Like don't be dry and explanatory. There's actually a lot you can do. I think to your second point about regulated industries and like where clients fits in, we're a different animal at Clearbank, I should say. You know, we're regulated by the FCA and the PRA. And the compliance team's job here is to ensure the firm adheres to the rules it's governed by. That's their job. And it's critical. But I would say actually, you know, it's all about a collaboration of working with compliance teams. You know, they generally understand what you're trying to achieve in sort of marketing and content. They understand the need for engaging with customers and prospects. It's just about talking to them about what you're trying to achieve, trying to understand, you know, for them, what are the red lines of like, we can't say this, we can't say that, you know, because you can have opinions and you can take a stance. It doesn't necessarily mean, you know, you're being combative or you're being negative or, you know, you're slating your direct competition. You know, it's far subtler than that. But it's just about working. I say, you know, I've worked with a couple of amazing compliance teams that if you just talk to them, like, okay, look, this is what we're trying to do. How much time do you need to review stuff? Because you guys are obviously busy with a lot of stuff. You know, talk to them about SLAs. You know, share your content calendar. Okay, if I give you a week between me having written something at the stakeholder or, you know, expert review it and I give it to you, is a week enough time for you to feed back on? And generally, you know, I find, you know, I've been in places where we've been able to go from like a draft to that review process to it being published within a week. I think when people think about compliance, they go, oh no, it's like, it's the thing that's going to stop everything happening. It's not. You need to have the conversation with them, get them to understand. I would say there's definitely a flip side in some of the more B2C world, right, where we've definitely seen, you know, a lot of missteps when it comes to like, let's say like advertising and people not putting, you know, the messages they're meant to put on stuff. And I think in those cases, you know, I don't think you can go, well, that I went with the creative and compliance killed it. Actually, no, it's very much on you as the marketing and the content creators to actually understand what the compliance rules are in a lot of those cases. Like, I don't think you can just say, well, I didn't know. It's like, it's actually your job to know when you're in a regulated industry what you can and can't say. And then you can start to think about, okay, if here's the boundary of where we can never cross and our content's here, how can we inch up over time to that? Whereas you might say, okay, we understand what you guys are trying to do. And really take it from there, because I think it really is the collaboration with compliance, and you'll soon find it's actually not that difficult. Or at least in my experience, it has not been that difficult if you don't go, oh, you know, we're going to do an advertising campaign. It's basically like, you know, all of our competitors' logos with X's through them and ours with like a nice group, and they're just going to go, well, what are you playing? You know, that's not how we're going to do stuff. Which is an incredibly extreme example, but you know, I think it's very much they will happily work with you, and I have happily worked with plenty of compliance to really understand and appreciate the role of marketing and content, understand what you're trying to do. They're also very much there, however, to protect an organization, just make sure, you know, you're not making false or misleading statements, for example. Particularly, I think if you're in that B2C world where, you know, you're trying to say, we do this, and it's like, do you though? And I think that's where we've seen people get into trouble.
Before we wrap up, could you give us your top tips for developing a content strategy?
You obviously have notions as like a content person of what you believe your content is, right? In terms of whether that is tone, style, how it interacts, like if it's going to be digitally native, if it's going to be this, that, and the other. Particularly in B2B fintech, there's a lot that's quite similar, but you have to really understand the nuance as well. So I think for me, I'm going to take this an approach of like, let's say if I was joining a new company, what would my headspace be at? For me, I'm a big fan of like that 30, 60, 90 approach. So, for those first like 30 days, right, you're just a sponge. You're meeting people, you're understanding where they fit in the organization, their roles, you're learning processes, you're learning internal language. And there's, we're in an industry that is unfortunately littered with acronyms, sometimes the same acronyms for completely different things. You're trying to wrap your head around that. You're trying to understand if there's brand guidelines and tone of voice documents. You're observing ways of working, like how does marketing interact with commercial, how does commercial interact with like customer support or customer success, how does that all ladder up? You're also looking at what your direct competitors, I guess, are doing. You're probably talking to like your PR agency and your comms team, so you're looking at their reports, like what are these guys doing, what's our share of voice look like, what metrics are we tracking. You're going through all that process, right? Then probably like at 60 days, you're already going to be delivering content. I think for most firms, just going to get like a couple of months of just sitting back going, oh, I'm just here to observe. Don't worry about me. You're probably already doing it, but you're also looking on that horizon, trying to define what needs to happen next. Most companies go through like a quarterly, half-year cycle of like, here's our strategy, here's the target, geographies or verticals we're looking at. So you start to think about, okay, how does content fit into that? What the big events we're doing? Where can I start to think about using content to either promote something, whether it's at an event, post event, or we're hosting our own events and trying to drive content from that. And I think when you've got to your 90 days, you've probably started to identify what's working. You've been looking at like the data. If your Google Analytics is playing nicely and that sort of thing, you start to go, okay, I can understand where we've got traction. You've probably seen what hasn't worked, either historically or with the stuff we tried to do. You've probably identified a lot of the obvious gaps. You probably, you've talked to commercial, and commercial are probably like, well, our biggest problems are X, Y, Z. So you're going to start thinking, okay, if it's a demand generation problem, then we need to start thinking about sort of like bigger pieces. If it's a closing the sale type thing, we're probably looking more sort of like a customer advocacy type program and where that's going to fit in and how that's going to work. And then, you've created your strategy, road tested it with like your CMO and marketing lead. You probably presented it, or in my experience at that point, you've presented it to the wider business or the leadership team, and then you've iterated it, and then you're already going, right? Because like I say, I think first month of it at Clearbank, we had like Innovate Finance and Money 2020. So while I was trying to do this, I was also very much, in the ground running and doing stuff. 11 festivals, 2 podcasts a week. So it was great to think about strategy, but you also had to think about the execution, just getting the stuff out there as well.
Geoff, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, you too.
Before I let you go, though, I can take you through our quick fire round. So, what podcast are you listening to right now?
All right, I'll give the dull business answer first, and then we'll get into the interesting stuff. So obviously, Fintech Insider. Shout out to Laura, Michael, Alex, and the team there for like always doing a stellar job. I think it's like the best place to just, if you're in this industry and you just need a download of what's going on, that's the one. I'm now going to get like way more nerdy on some of this stuff. So one of my favorite ones at the moment is 1001 Album Club, which is basically these guys in the States are going through this book, 1001 albums you must hear before you die, and every episode they're listening to the album and then like dissecting it. And it's funny because some stuff they love, some stuff they hate, some stuff they're really ambivalent about. I've learned a ton about like how certain albums came about, who are those random people talking at the beginning of What's Going On by Marvin Gaye? Turns out that it's the Detroit Lions NFL team. It's all these like random little facts. So I love that. I am a bit of a geek, and I love this podcast called Fat Man Beyond, which is I don't know, Kevin Smith, the guy who directed Clerks and Mallrats. It's him and this guy Mark Bernard, and they just like review like the latest Marvel things, latest things on Disney, and just it's a really like good fun time. I'd say the final one, and this is definitely showing geekdom here, is I'm a massive Star Wars fan. So if you like anything Star Wars, there's a podcast called A More Civilized Age, which is superb. It began as a podcast about the Clone Wars cartoon. They've since done the prequel films. They did a week-by-week watch-along of Andor, which I was very, very into. They've done an episode like dissecting the music of Andor and how it's very different stylistically from the rest of the Star Wars canon, which to me is just like absolute geek heaven. It's like you and your mates down the pub chatting about Star Wars. Like, big fan of that.
I've actually just started watching Star Wars for the first time. So me
What?
and my son are watching the films in order of production, not chronologically.
All right.
And we're getting like half an hour in every day sort of thing. And so we've done 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. So we're halfway through sort of episode 7 at the moment.
Yeah.
I've got to be honest, I struggled with the first few, but I'm really getting into it.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things, like, it's such a cultural phenomenon, right, that people read some interesting stuff into it, and then other people read like way too much into it, and sometimes you go,
Yeah.
it's just cowboys and Indians in space and not actually any deeper than that. And if you take it, you can take it at any level I think you want to watch it at and just have a bit of fun with it. But I will say, like, that More Civilized Age podcast actually does some really interesting stuff about the prequel films. Not the first one, but the second and third one. They were filmed post 9/11 and the war on terror, and there's a lot of analogous stuff if you look into it about, the rise of fascism. Again, see, like, we've gone down a weird path already, but there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on.
At the moment, I'm geeking out on Sopranos at the moment, so I've been listening to Talking Sopranos.
Yeah.
They do a week by week breakdown of every episode, and I've watched Sopranos more times than the actors who are actually presenting the podcast.
I think anything that takes like that level of just like fandom and geekdom just to the right level of interest and not beyond is always like a great listen, because he's like, oh, these people get me. Okay, we can all geek out together,
What's your favorite fintech company or favorite fintech app?
I'm a big fan of Chip. Caveat is a Clearbank customer. I'm not saying that because I need to. I just really like how they've made like that whole micro saving thing an absolute breeze by connecting your bank account up. And I just think it started off as a very simple service, and they've added sort of, savings accounts on top of it and pots where you can put money. And I just think the UX of it is just, it's very clear what it's trying to do. It's not trying to do too much. I feel like it's just doing the right amount of stuff to really help enforce a really good habit. So I'm a big fan of them, I have to say. Is like, that's one of my most used apps for sure. I guess in terms of just like fintech brands, I might be in a minority here. I really quite like the Swift rebrand, and we're talking about a company that's like 50 years old and has been like quite stodgy. But I think they've done some really interesting stuff. I feel like they've actually finally embraced a lot of change that was going on in the industry around. So I found that how they've evolved that fascinating. I think just some of the names I can throw out there, like, I really like what Bunk does in terms of like a bank and how it presents itself. Big fan of Circa 5000, which is like an investing app. It has like a more ethical ethos, but in a very genuine way. And I think they've really balanced education without being preachy about what's a very important topic of like, what are you investing in? Do you know? And I'd say probably my final one is a company called Penfold, which is a pensions app, but they've really focused on trying to help people who've traditionally not maybe had workplace pensions, like freelancers, those sort of people, to just start saving for retirement. Because it's one of those exceptionally boring things that, frankly, most of us don't really think about very often, but really we do need to think about. And I think, again, they've done it in a very, very smart way where they're trying to educate without being preachy. So I think I'm a big fan of apps that are trying to do that.
And what books are you currently reading, or would you recommend?
I was not always the biggest fan of reading. I'm actually pretty terrible at finishing books. So I've started rereading In Search of the Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson, which is a book I've started twice and somehow never finished. So I'm determined to finish that one. Others to recommend, I love some of the stuff like, I think particularly what's just going on in the world right now. If you haven't read The Handmaid's Tale, but have maybe watched the TV series, read The Handmaid's Tale. It's a beautifully constructed work. And then probably my final, which is it's just such a captain obvious thing, but I think Joan Didion's Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I pick that up every so often and just read bits of it because I think it's just a work of absolute genius.
Cool. Yeah, I wasn't as fortunate as you in school. We did we did Kestrel for a Knave, I think. which was a struggle to get through.
Yeah, I think when you're doing English lit, it's all like Thomas Hardy and Shakespeare. It all just
Yeah.
feels like so dense. When you don't have that mix of the more contemporary stuff as well, it can be very. You can understand why a bunch of people are like, "Ugh, books."
Yeah, exactly.
This is what it is. Like, why would I be interested? And I think it's a real shame, because I think books are. But if you think about the cost of like your average paperback, right? I think there's so much knowledge for that cost that it's almost unbeatable.
And my last question is, what's one thing that I haven't asked you that I perhaps should have?
This is probably one for another episode with someone who's maybe more in tune with this sort of stuff. But I think if we're just looking at what's going to happen next, like what is Chat GPT and large language models and this sort of stuff going to do for content creation, content distribution? Will it kill a lot of mediocre SEO content? I certainly hope so, because I think there's a lot of very bland stuff out there.
I think it will create more.
And this is the problem, right? Is it actually going to create a different set of problems? I've played around with it. I find it's quite interesting for sort of like organizing thoughts, like disparate ideas I have in my head, and whether they sort of connect together. I think in terms of actual writing of content, it's going to have a role, but I think again, it's going to come down to, if you're using it, it's going to be very, very obvious, I think, pretty quickly that you've been using it in what you do. I think there's a whole shake-up that's going to happen with that's coming down the line, and none of us really know how it's going to shake out. But if you are in content and you aren't at least exploring it and just playing around in your own time, then I think it's a big mistake, because it is going to have an impact, and you need to understand sort of the prompting models and the outputs and the sense checking of the outputs and all those sort of things, because it is going to be something everyone's going to have to think about, and pretty soon, I think.
Geoff, absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The FML podcast is brought to you by Growth Gorilla. To find out how our growth marketing experts can boost your fintech's growth, head to growthgorilla.co.uk. And make sure to search for the FML podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Don't forget to click follow to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Growth Gorilla, thanks for listening.